Thank you, Sal. Now we have Elizabeth Cameron from the Brown University School of Public Health.
Thanks so much. I'm going to start really quickly before turning to slides with just a quick story of political will, because I think we're all here today to motivate political will for pandemic preparedness and response. But maybe even before I start, to say that I'm really here on behalf of the G20 High-Level Independent Panel and its members to talk about our recommendations. I'd also like to thank so many people in this room, but just by name, Serena, Magnus, Priya, Laurent, Rebecca, for her years of work here, reps from Gavi, Africa CDC, CEPI, the Gates Foundation, and others who in their personal capacities helped inform this work and really put a lot of time and effort into it. So this is really a group effort, and I'm pleased to be the one able to present it today. But before I get there, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the political will that really started here in Italy in the G20 in 2021, which Daniele knows this story quite well as the leader of it. In January of 2020, I was sitting in my office at a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., where a meeting had been convened to talk about a fund and the importance coming out of the Ebola epidemic of having catalytic financing for countries to get prepared for the next pandemic. I think Rebecca was there. Halfway through the meeting, someone walked in late and said, "Why are we talking about the future? We have a coronavirus circulating right now, and have you heard what's happening with it?" A year later, I found myself in 2021 sitting in the White House, working with colleagues around the world to try to convince leaders that even while we were in the middle of a crisis, we needed to focus on the next outbreak. COVID was a year old. Ebola, we thought, would soon be breaking out somewhere. It did in the next month, in February of 2021, in both the Democratic Republic of Congo and Guinea. And to use a really American phrase, we needed to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We needed to be ready for the next outbreak, even while we were in the middle of the COVID crisis. And at exactly the same time, the G20 presidency was gearing up here in Italy, and taking very serious action to convene a high-level independent panel to look at exactly that. And really, Daniele, Francesca, and probably many others in this room that I didn't know were really laying the groundwork to be ready. And it's very hard to motivate that kind of political will during a crisis. So the G20 High-Level Independent Panel, I'll talk briefly about what it is. I think many people here were instrumental in its work, but many of you may not know what it is or why it exists. So I'll talk very quickly about that. And then we released new recommendations this week. I'll just say up front, if you listen to nothing else that I say, go online, look at the recommendations, or make sure that you have access to them. So the High-Level Independent Panel was established in January of 2021 in order to look forward, even in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And the final report was issued to the finance ministers here in Italy and the central bank governors in July of 2021. It was called A Global Deal for Our Pandemic Age. And hearkening back to the stories that we heard from OECD, from Mark, we are in a pandemic age. It's definitely not a matter of if, but when. In 2021, the key findings of the High-Level Independent Panel were that we needed investment in global public goods, things like disease surveillance. We heard Eddie talk quite a bit about the concept of having a radar system, for lack of a better word, for pandemic threats. We also have heard that from a number of the modelers who spoke yesterday. The panel also recommended that governments needed to commit to funding those global public goods to the tune of at least $75 billion over 5 years, or $15 billion per year for at least 5 years, with sustained investments at that level to follow. They asked for the establishment of a global health threats fund. We just heard Priya present on what became the pandemic fund, with a US $10 billion commitment. We're not quite there yet per year. We're quite under that level, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the idea was really critical. And they also recognized that money alone would not deliver a safer world, that we needed health and finance ministers to sustainably come together. We've been speaking about that a lot here this week. And they recommended a Global Health Threats Board, which became the Joint Finance and Health Task Force of the G20, which Serena Ng, who will speak after our coffee break, has the privilege of leading, and I've had the privilege of working with her throughout this process. I won't speak much about the pandemic fund because Priya has gone before me and laid this down in detail, but to say that this was one of the greatest achievements of the high-level independent panel was really pushing for this. And I can say personally from my perch in 2021, sitting in the White House trying to push for this, that without the high-level independent panel, without Italy's presidency and Indonesia's that followed, we would not have a pandemic fund, full stop. So why did the high-level independent panel come back? Well, we've been talking quite a lot about the current context here for the pandemic fund, for the high-level independent panel. But critically, despite strong political will in the aftermath of COVID-19 and some progress on sustainable financing, we have seen massive cuts in high-income country official development assistance, which have really led to significant disruptions in global health. We've also seen that we've got an increasingly fragmenting world, and to use a quote that came out of the high-level independent panel's forward, we are really standing at a precipice of pandemic preparedness, and we know that investments in pandemic preparedness and response have significant returns on investment. We also know that pandemic response costs quite a lot. There's a number of different estimates. We struggled over which one to use in our report, but suffice it to say, billions and billions, over hundreds of billions per year over all future years is something that's quite conservative that most economists that informed our report could agree upon. So to address these issues, the high-level independent panel reconvened in order to inform the South African G20 presidency. And it includes some of the previous members of the panel and also some new members. It is co-chaired by Victor Zhao, the president of our National Academy of Medicine, Jane Halton, who chairs CEPI's board, Jean Kaseya, the Director General of Africa CDC, Benedicta Rama, who until very recently was the president and chair of Afreximbank, and Jan Arne Radingen, the CEO of Welcome. It also includes a number of very distinguished members, including World Trade Organization Director General Ngozi, who was a co-chair of the previous high-level independent panel, and a number of others across health and finance. I won't read them all, but many of them are quite well known to you. And we called it Closing the Deal, Financing Our Security Against Pandemic Threats. So the charge for the high-level independent panel was actually quite clear. It was to be bold and practical. It's very hard to be both of those things at once. And we were also asked to look at a couple of key issue areas. The first being unlocking medical countermeasures access and surge manufacturing financing. So recognizing that we didn't have enough financing to surge outbreak response, but we needed to also have that manufacturing capacity in the first place before you can actually surge it to scale and speed. The second area was mobilizing preparedness financing. And to convene around these issues, we actually convened almost 100, maybe 75 to 100 experts from around the world who met over the course of June through September of this year to quickly look at what has been done and to come up with some additional bold and practical ways to address the issues that I raised before and that we've been talking about here without official development assistance at sustainable levels for a number of years. And given the rise in ownership and sovereignty amongst in particular African countries, and Raji talked about this yesterday, how could the high-level independent panel provide some recommendations to address what to do in the future that could actually be sustainable and to get at some of the issues we've been discussing here? So findings and recommendations, what was discovered? So first and foremost, the high-level independent panel looked at 5 critical gaps. And the first gap we've been speaking about a lot, how to mobilize domestic resources in the absence of official development assistance or with significantly decreased levels. We also looked at non-official development assistance financing and just came to the conclusion also that we heard a lot about from Mark and we'll probably hear about from Magnus, which is that financing isn't well tracked and it's really difficult to understand where it's coming from. Second, insufficient access and financing to medical countermeasures and in particular surge financing and blended approaches. Third, multilateral and other development bank incentives and emergency access to medical countermeasures. During the COVID pandemic, I don't have to tell this group, it was really difficult to access financing, including at risk, for medical countermeasures that had not yet been approved. And this is a persistent challenge that the World Bank has been working on, and Magnus in particular has been working on it for quite some time, but we're not there yet. The fourth gap was tests, treatments, and personal protective equipment. Quite simply, we've made a bit of progress on vaccines. We still have a ways to go, and you heard a lot from Saul about the great work that CEPI is doing, but there isn't the same kind of sustainable hub of activity around tests, treatments, or PPE, including not only therapeutics, but also oxygen, quite frankly. And then fifth, the pandemic fund. It's doing quite a lot, but it is not yet sustainably capitalized. So 5 recommendations for the 5 financing gaps, and I'll just run through them relatively quickly. So the first recommendation is based on unlocking domestic resources and, to the extent possible, non-ODA spending and rigorously tracking results. I should also say that in the report, there's a recommendation, but then a series of enabling actions. It is quite dense, but it's dense on purpose because the goal was to actually put down a roadmap for how to get these things done, and the timeline is for it to be substantially along the way with all 5 recommendations in time for the UN high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, which takes place next September. So it's ambitious. So recommendation number 1, the high-level independent panel asks for 3 minimum benchmarks for annual pandemic PPR financing, and I stress minimum. The first being that governments, building on an analysis that OECD, WHO, and the World Bank did earlier this year, which was poured over by our group and in conjunction with a number of experts, including some in this room, the panel came to the conclusion that a minimum of 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP per year per country should be spent on pandemic PPR, and that's probably a floor, not a ceiling. The second benchmark is that G20 and other high-income and upper-middle-income countries should put forward at least 0.5 to 1% of security and defense budget spending on biosecurity, biosurveillance, and the 100 Days mission, the portions of pandemic preparedness and response that would fit with the security and defense budget. I think that this is really important, actually, in order to bring these sectors even more clearly into the pandemic preparedness and response fold, and to be able to track that spending more clearly, and certainly in light of the increases in NATO budgeting, it seems like this is something that should be, in my mind, achievable. And then the third benchmark is reiterating the benchmark that the high-level independent panel put forward in 2021, which is that at least $15 billion per year should be put forward for global public goods, including to fight cross-border threats, and this is in particular disease surveillance. The other thing that the high-level independent panel strongly recommended was to pay more attention to response and preparedness in fragile settings, and really made a relatively bold recommendation, and a really important one in my view, that direct bilateral ODA and/or multilateral development bank financing should go to civil society organizations operating in fragile settings. And then finally, we recommended a global pandemic spending tracker, which I think fits with what we've heard today. We can't sustainably track where pandemic financing is going and where it's coming from. So the second and third recommendation are around multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, and these really fit with the surge financing charge that the high-level independent panel took very seriously. So the second recommendation is to accelerate geographically diversified access to countermeasures and surge financing, and in particular, really supercharging the facility that the International Finance Corporation is already starting to build, but which it has not yet launched. And the recommendation specifically is that IFC and other development finance institutions should partner to launch and finalize at least one dedicated, blended MCM surge financing facility within the next 6 to 12 months. In addition, we recommended that there should be an associated standby list of regional manufacturers coming out of that facility that would be eligible and have pre-negotiated lines of credit. And linked to that effort, we want to see philanthropies launch an operational platform that would link up in order to provide assistance for manufacturers that might not quite meet the level of the IFC facility, but in order to, especially for underrepresented products like tests, treatments, and PPE, to create a larger pool of manufacturers regionally. And then finally, that facility should leverage ongoing design work that's happening within the MCM Surge Financing Initiative that was launched a couple of years ago in the context of the G7+. I'll be quick. Recommendation 3 is around at-risk financing, and this is work that is underway but has not yet been fully completed. And this is that all multilateral development banks and public development banks should enable pre-negotiated, rapid, and effective at-risk surge financing. And quite simply, this is the challenge that low and lower middle-income countries had in accessing loans from the World Bank and other development banks in order to get access to countermeasures that had not yet been approved. We also looked at medical countermeasures that have been approved and found that pre-qualification simply takes too long when there's already a stringent regulatory authority that has approved a product. There should be a temporary provision put forward for those products so that countries can access them more quickly. This was a huge problem with MPOX in the past couple of years. And then finally, there should be a revolving capital fund in each region modeled after the PAHO revolving fund. The fourth recommendation on operationalizing financing for test treatments and PPE is relatively straightforward. There isn't a specific international hub or anchor institution for test treatments and PPE, and there should be, specific to pandemic preparedness and response, and there should be a financing strategy around it. And then in addition to that, specifically with PPE, the panel found that there should be at least one PPE manufacturing hub per region with regional stockpiles, including for long shelf life products. This is really, again, hearkening back to the earliest days of the response and products that we simply did not have in the first, predating the 100 days of the 100 days mission. What do we need on day one? And then last but certainly not least, the pandemic fund should be the world's premier preparedness financing facility. It was recommended by the G20. It was launched in 2022. It's made quite a bit of progress in a short period of time. It has a ways to go. It has some innovative work underway. But in particular, the work with multilateral development banks should be supercharged. And so we really recommend securing structured agreements with each of the MDBs so that the pandemic fund can continue its work to catalyze domestic resources in low and lower middle income countries. And then finally, we ask for a sustainable standing allocation for the pandemic fund. And this is a relatively bold recommendation, but it's an important one. If the banks aren't willing to put in capital to sustain the fund, it will be reliant on ODA, and that is not a sustainable solution in the coming years. And so finally, moments of great change can unveil some unexpected opportunities. There are some opportunities presented by the chaotic situation that we're in. And going forward, the panel really commits itself to working to implement these recommendations, working with the Joint Finance and Health Task Force, working with individuals here, and working, I should have said, in their independent capacities, which is quite important to the panelists. I serve as the special advisor to the panel. It's been my pleasure to present the recommendations. And I didn't have it in this version of the slide presentation, but we did have some really great press, including from President von der Leyen. Thank you for sharing that with me, Laurent, as well as Dr. Kaseya and others. So I encourage you to take a look, and I will put forward the link for the recommendations after the break. Thanks so much.